Good morning. Thank you, Pastor David. I am shocked. Shocked.
That I didn't read all 3 pages?
No, that you would let a Texas politician into your pulpit on a Sunday morning. But in defense of the pastor, I am a recovering politician. Every Tuesday night I go to a meeting. I'm a recovering politician. I'm now 3 years clean off the ballot, just so y'all know. So we can start this morning a little bit more relaxed. I don't know. I don't know if I should admit this to you. I had a dream about your pastor last night. Well, we got to, it was bad and good. It was bad. We both died on the same day.
Okay.
We get to heaven, get in the tour. St. Peter showing us around, get to this, little shack. I mean, it's nothing. It's a little cot, little desk. That's it.
Is that yours?
Pastor David, this is your home in heaven. I'm looking at that shack. I'm thinking, man, this ain't what I expected. Get around the corner, big mansion, gold pillars, all the stuff you dream of. He said, Rick, this is your home in heaven. I said, wait. Why does that good and holy man get that shack and I get this beautiful mansion? He said, well, son, you just got here. You don't know how it works. He said, we got all the preachers up here we want. You're the first politician to ever make it. But we do something a little different for you. So, yes, we tend to be a little bit cynical about the world of politics. In fact, we sometimes think it's outside of a biblical worldview, when in fact nothing is outside a biblical worldview. And what we need is not more politicians, we need more patriots. And there's a difference. A politician is only thinking about the next election. A patriot is thinking about the next generation. And that's the mindset that we want to have. We want to have a mindset that says, Lord, we've been blessed with this wonderful talent of freedom. We've been blessed with a talent that we don't want to bury. We don't want to be the wicked and slothful servant. It's a talent that we want to invest in, we want to use, we want to multiply so that we can actually be faithful with what God has given us. And so this morning I want to chat with you for just a few minutes, if I can, about biblical citizenship in our Creator with certain inalienable rights. That means our freedom comes from God. That means government doesn't give it to us. Therefore, government can't take it away. It's something that God gave us, which also comes with a lot of responsibility. So if we're given this freedom by God, how do we actually live it out? Well, the first thing we got to recognize is that there is truth. This frame of freedom that holds your picture in place, that holds my picture in place, this frame only works if we recognize the fundamental foundation of moral absolutes and truth. See, the founders, when they said we hold these truths to be self-evident, said there's some things that don't change. The laws of nature and nature's God are everlasting. They don't change. And therefore, if we have a bedrock principle upon which to build, we can build a great nation, and we can keep it great if we remember those fundamental principles. So I'm going to point out 4 quick things out of that frame. First of all, that there is truth. There are moral absolutes, and that we get those moral absolutes from our biblical worldview. And I don't want you to take it from me. I want you to take it from the guys that gave us the country. So Washington said, of all the habits and dispositions which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. So if you think about just the idea of, I want to live in freedom, I want to pass freedom to my children and grandchildren, so what creates that, or what produces that? What's the cause for the effect of freedom and liberty? Washington is telling us that of all the pieces of the cause that produces the effect of freedom and liberty, of all of those different elements, religion and morality are absolutely indispensable. You got to have them. Because the way our freedom is designed, if you don't have a people that have a foundation of religion and liberty, you end up losing the liberty. And it's just logical. I mean, just think about it. If a nation is made up mostly of people that are able to govern themselves because they have a faith that causes them to act in a positive way towards their fellow man, you need less government in order to police that. But as your people put away those foundational beliefs, and they no longer believe there's a God that's going to hold me accountable, and they decide I am a justice unto myself, I get to decide what's right or wrong, it's all up to me. Freedom means I can do anything and everything that I want. Well, the logical result of that is that you need more government to keep us from raping and murdering and stealing from each other, because now everybody just decides they want whatever they want. And you see it throughout history. The more that people do not have religion and morality, the more government has to grow in order to just keep society somewhat safe. So he was right about the fact that we need religion and morality at that foundation. And in fact, I use the word patriot a lot because I love the story of our founding fathers, and I love coming to this part of the country, and it feels like I'm walking back in time and reliving that history. But George Washington said you couldn't be a patriot if you didn't work to preserve those principles, and certainly if you worked against them. In fact, he said, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism that would work to subvert these great pillars. He's referring to religion and morality. And this is actually from his farewell address to the nation. So it's essentially his warning to the country and his challenge to the country that if you want this to survive beyond yourself, you've got to have certain things and you've got to make sure you don't do certain things. And he was actually watching the French Revolution at the time, so he's observing a nation try to get American freedom without the full American formula. So the American formula is there's a God, he gives freedom to the people, then people set up the government for the purpose of preserving their liberty. That's actually what the Declaration specifically describes. The French saw us enjoying that, wanted that, but they said we don't want God in the equation. So we want libertas, but we don't want religion and morality. And of course, it led to the guillotine and total chaos. Washington's observing that take place. So he gives his warning to the nation, hey, don't ever go the French route where you try to have freedom and liberty without God. It will lead to total chaos. So we've got to have those truths. Of course, a huge part of those truths would mean that we have to have a creator recognized, acknowledged. Doesn't mean we have to all belong to the exact same denomination, not even necessarily the exact same faith, but there has to be an acknowledgement in the culture that there is something greater than ourselves, and there is someone we're going to answer to in a later life in order for that culture to really work well. So they talked about the creator being in the equation. And here's where I'm going to sidestep into a little bit of apologetics, I guess, if you will, on the country. And I want to counter some of and respond to some of the arguments today on virtually every college campus in the nation that the founders weren't Christians, that they were atheists, agnostics, and deists. We hear that over and over and over again, so much so that most people in America believe that. They think the founders were a bunch of atheists, agnostics, and deists. And so I don't have time to give you all the founders, about 247 guys we consider to be the founders of our nation. That's the guys that signed the Declaration, the Constitution, the governors, the major generals at the time, the key players in the Revolution. But I do want to hit on a few of these guys. John Adams, one of my favorites. He actually we probably wouldn't have a nation without him. He really was the force behind the Declaration, even though Jefferson wrote it. He's the guy that was really twisting the arms behind the scenes and making the deals and getting the votes necessary to get it done. And Adams said the general principles upon which the founders achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. So he's saying really as a nation, the principles, if we're going to have that frequent recurrence to fundamental principles, he's saying the principles that this nation was founded upon were the principles of Christianity. Now I find it interesting that this is more than 200 years ago when he said this. He's saying this is what we're founded upon, and you get the time machine and you look at that, and then you come to where we are today. You can't even say the name Jesus Christ at a public school graduation without getting in trouble now. Now how are we founded on Christian principles? But then we're going to say to that gal in Colorado, we turn the microphone off on her as she's giving her valedictorian address simply because she mentions the name of Christ in her valedictorian address. The one in Nevada, the school said, you're going to have to issue a public apology because you mentioned Jesus. We're not going to give you your diploma until you issue a public apology for saying the name of Christ. Wait, we're founded on the principles of Christianity, and now we can't even say his name in public like that. We arrest pastors on sidewalks for reading the Bible out loud. We have a pastor in Phoenix that spent 60 days in jail for the Bible study in his home being too large. The Super Bowl party would have been fine, but the city of Phoenix said you can't have a religious gathering that's that size. I mean, these things that are happening right now completely ignore where we came from. You take the father of the country who I mentioned earlier, Washington. This is a man that a lot of debate over what he actually believed, but the best thing to do is look at what he actually did. You can learn that by visiting with his friends. You can go talk to the people that spent time with him. You can do that by reading their journals and reading their correspondence. These guys wrote letters to each other the way we text each other today. I mean, thousands and thousands of volumes of letters. You can read Secretary Thompson. He actually was there in Congress with Washington. He talks in his journal about accidentally walking in on President Washington, accidentally interrupting him. He's kneeling in prayer. Same thing with General Knox throughout the war. In fact, multiple times in his journal. He talks about walking in on General Washington in his tent, accidentally interrupted him. Guess what he's doing? Praying, right? You go down to Valley Forge, not far from here, and you'll see the big bronze monument there, Freedom's Foundation. It's reflecting George Washington kneeling in prayer. The stained glass window at Valley Forge is George Washington kneeling in prayer. The private prayer room of our congressman actually right now. Oh, that's the statue just down the street. That's at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. right now. There's a private prayer room just off of the floor. And it's actually got Washington kneeling in prayer. We've all seen the paintings of George Washington kneeling in prayer. I mean, I just think it's amazing that an atheist founding father would pray that much. If we people of faith would pray near as much as our atheist founding fathers, the country would probably be in better shape. But there's a lot of these guys you may not be familiar with. Same thing in their lives as far as faith being the foundation. James Wilson we should know because he's actually one of our most important founding fathers. He gave us both documents, so he's one of only 6 guys to sign both the Declaration and the Constitution, and he served on the Supreme Court. So, I mean, this is a guy we can look to as an expert on the Constitution, on the founding of the country, the implementation of that later as we were a young nation. And he actually spoke at the convention more than anyone else except Gouverneur Morris. So he spoke 168 times. Morris spoke 173. The two greatest influences on the Constitution. But here's what he said for us this morning. This is a big question today in a lot of cases now going before the Supreme Court. He said human law. So just to put that in today's context, that's what your city council passes. That's what your state legislature passes, what Congress passes. All of our human law, criminal, civil, all of that human law, he said, must rest its authority ultimately upon that law which is divine. He said, far from being rivals or enemies, religion and law are twin sisters. They're friends. They're mutual assistants. Indeed, these two sciences run into each other, meaning, not meaning they run into each other like a couple of Mack trucks, which is what happens now. You mention a Bible verse in a courtroom or anything like that, you get in all kinds of trouble. What he was saying was they run into each other like a couple of oxen, pulling together to give us a good culture and a good society. So an expert like that is saying, yes, your law should be based on a higher law. So a lot of people tell me, Rick, you can't define marriage. One man and one woman. Why, that's bringing the Bible into government. I've been working on a really deep philosophical response to that. When they say you can't define marriage as one man and one woman, why that brings the Bible into government, my response is, yep. Because first of all, it doesn't matter what I think, but if you go back to the founders, they're saying that's exactly what you ought to be doing. Your law should be based on the higher law. And when you ignore the higher law and you start making law just based on whatever feels good, finger to the wind, whatever's popular at the time, that's when you know you're going to lose those freedoms and that liberty. Now, you probably recognize this picture here. Those are the 56 atheists that signed the Declaration of Independence. Of course, they're not only atheists, we're told that they're enemies of Christ. So I love thinking about this. I try to get my time machine because today, if you're an enemy of Christ in 2019, there's plenty of things to do, right? But what if you're an atheist enemy of Christ and you live in 1776? I mean, what do you do for a hobby, right? Let's find out what these atheist enemies of Christ were doing in their spare time. We'll just hit a few of them. That guy sitting back there in the corner, that's the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon, a pastor in Congress. In fact, 29 of the 56 held what we would today call seminary degrees, which is pretty good for a bunch of atheist enemies of Christ to go to seminary. Nothing else to do. I guess they were just doing opposition research on this Jesus guy. I'm sure that's all it was. There was nothing else there, I'm sure. Witherspoon, by the way, responsible for 2 American translations of the Bible, and you're looking at the Billy Graham of that day. Best known evangelist throughout the colonies. His sermons were spread throughout the colonies. Just a phenomenal founder. And he actually trained many of the founding fathers himself. Here we have Secretary Thompson. I mentioned he's actually the guy that did the Thompson Bible. He spent 25 years of his life translating the Greek Septuagint into English. So pretty good activity for an atheist enemy of Christ. Benjamin Rush here, from right here in Pennsylvania, founded the first Bible society in America, the Philadelphia Bible Society. Now, within a few years, these guys had dozens of Bible societies, American Bible Society, all these different Bible societies, for the purpose of what? What do you do with a Bible society? Why would you even have one? Read the Bible, study the Bible, what else? Distribute it, right? Get it out there. Get it in as many hands as possible. I just think that's interesting that a bunch of atheist founding fathers were studying the Bible and get it out to as many people as possible. Rush also, by the way, along with Benjamin Franklin, started the first abolition society in America, and that's the reason they wanted independence. So we'd abolished slavery in 3 or 4 states before the war. King George vetoed all those laws, says you're keeping slavery whether you want it or not. So some of these guys said that's why we want independence, to get rid of slavery. Now, clearly, they thought we'd do it at independence. Clearly, they got that wrong. It took another 100 years. But from the beginning, guys like Rush were on the right side of that. So, look, this is kind of I don't have time to go through all these guys, so we'll just do the ShamWow part of the presentation. This is where I say, but wait, there's more. Because right here, this moment, September 7th, 1774, that's the opening session of Congress. This is the first time our United States Congress met. Pretty good. It looks like a prayer revival to me, right? I mean, according to John Adams, now Silas Dean wrote home, he said this was a prayer worth riding 100 miles to hear. John Adams said that he wrote home to Abigail. He said the Reverend Jacob Duché came in. We prayed for 3 hours. We studied out of Psalms 35. He said God so spoke to us out of Psalms 35. We believe for the first time we could defeat the British. Tell everybody back home. Study Psalms 35. prayer and a Bible study by a bunch of atheists in Congress to kick this thing off. That, by the way, you can go visit Carpenter's Hall right downtown in Philly. We did one of our episodes for Chasing American Legends there, and it's just so cool to walk in there and think about what happened in that room and how that forged these guys and what that probably did to Washington's thinking and how that affected his decisions later with crossing the Delaware and all the other things that happened. But the main point here is that these guys actually were calling upon God from the very beginning. Now, for the sake of time, since we can't do all these guys, I will tell you right now, we document it for you. Out of 247 guys, there are 10 that I got to take off the table and say they weren't Christians. Okay, 10 out of 247 leaves me with 95% of the Founding Fathers. Outspoken Christians, lived it, talked it, spoke it, wrote it. There's no question about it. It's all documented. The 10 I'm taking off the table were not atheists. They were not agnostics. They were not even deists. By the way, we use that term today. They didn't believe in some watchmaker God that put everything in motion and then had nothing to do with us. The only guy you can maybe give that definition would be Thomas Paine. The other guys, while not Christians, didn't believe Jesus to be the Son of God, certainly believed in God, believed in the hand of providence, believed God was involved in our daily lives, but did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. So we say they're not Christians, we'll take them off the table there. But their worldview still reflected the idea that we need God in the equation. And that's just the 10 I'm taking off the table, let alone the 95%. So let's take, for instance, Benjamin Franklin. Probably, other than Paine, the least religious founding father. Even the left, right, center, virtually everybody that studies these guys agrees on that. So let's just take the least religious of the founding fathers. And let's get in our time machine and let's go back to 1787, middle of the summer, and the Constitutional Convention is falling apart. We're about 5 weeks into the convention. They can't reach agreement on slavery, on ratification, big state, small state, they're giving up. People are literally leaving the convention and saying it's never going to happen, we're going home. So at that point, about 5 weeks in, Franklin, by the way, is the elder statesman of the group. Franklin at the convention is 81 years old. I used to think that was old. It's getting younger and younger. I was actually at an event several years ago when I had much more hair and it was darker. But I was a young man, and the congressman introducing me was 81. He just turned 81, and he's introducing me, and he's about to bring me up, and he goes, "Rick," he said, "I just turned 81," and he said, "I bet you think that's old, but let me just tell you." He said, "I was at Senator Strom Thurmond's 100-year birthday party, and Thurmond looked over at me and said, 'Oh, to be 80 again.'" So 80's young today. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, 80 was not young in the founding era. Average lifespan back then, 33, 34 years old. So 81, he's the elder statesman. And so he rises to try to save the day, try to save the convention. And of course, all the guys in the room obviously respected him and listened closely. And he started off with a history lesson. I think that's pretty intriguing, at least to me, that only 11 years into our nation, the very guys that gave us the nation needed to be reminded of their history. They weren't doing the fundamental principles and the frequent recurrence. And so Franklin decides to give them a bit of a history lesson. He stands up and says, "In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection." So see, Franklin could say that in the room because, like James Wilson, who I mentioned earlier, Franklin's one of only 6 guys to sign both documents. So he can say to the other guys in the room, "Hey, I was in here, same room, not far from here at Independence Hall. I was in this room 11 years ago when we didn't have a chance. We were taking on," think about what they were doing, taking on the greatest military power on the planet. Very little to show for it, no chance of winning. The odds were totally against us. And he said, for us to do that, we knew we couldn't do it without God on our side. So he said, we prayed, and he said, oh yeah, there he is at the Declaration and then at the Constitutional Convention. Anyway, he said, our prayers were heard and they were graciously answered. All of us engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. Then he asked the very question we need to ask today. Have we now forgotten this powerful friend? Do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? I've lived for a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth. God governs in the affairs of men. You know this part. If a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We've been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and his blessing on our deliberation be held in this assembly, but only once and in private, because if the ACLU finds out, we'll all be in trouble. And These three are awake. I'm going to come talk to y'all for a minute. Awesome. They're asleep. So we're just going to have a private conversation. Just us. Of course, he didn't say once. He said every morning before we proceed to business. You should go read the whole speech. He quotes 11 Bible verses in this short speech. Talks about the Father of lights illuminating our understanding, how we're not smart enough to solve the major problems in our culture or design a nation that's going to be successful unless we have God in the equation. That was our founding fathers. Now you fast forward to where we are today, and back in 1962, the court began to remove God from the equation and say we no longer think it's worthwhile to acknowledge God. In fact, we think it will cause damage to our children to do so. That's why in Abington v. Murray v. Collette in 1963, they said no more Bibles in the classroom. In 62, a year before, in Ingle v. Vitale, they said no more prayer in our schools. Now you can't pray at a football game. You can't pray. You can't have the Pledge of Allegiance in some places around the country because of under God in the pledge. We take out the Ten Commandments. We remove virtually any idea of God in our system. Now we're forcing companies out of business, and we're fining and threatening them with jail if they don't take their gift and their talent and participate in things that violate their very conscience. It's happening in our country. It's happening in my home state of Texas. We've had some victories, partial victories at the Supreme Court level, which shouldn't be deciding these things anyway, but that's a whole other topic. You got to get a Constitution class, right, Charlie, in order to dive into the proper role of the court. But we've had some victories of personal freedom and people being able to not have to violate their conscience, but it's a tough battle. I think what Jefferson said really fits where we are today. He said, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure? In other words, can we have liberty last in our nation and pass it to the next generation? If we lose the idea, be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis. So it's a really important thing to remember. The firm basis of liberty, according to Thomas Jefferson, is a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they're not to be violated without his wrath. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and his justice cannot sleep forever. Simply saying, you're going to have a very different nation if as a nation as a whole, you forget the source of your freedom. If you forget that God's your freedom, you start living under yourself and doing whatever feels good at the time. If you remember that God's the source of your freedom, you will act different because you want to live your freedom out according to his design. My mentor Zig Ziglar always said the best blessings are found within God's boundaries. So if you're living within God's design, you get the great blessings that he designed for us to have, but outside of that, you don't. So consider the governed as the part of the Declaration that gives us the ability to restore these things that we've been talking about. I don't want you to think when I refer to a lot of the bad things that are happening in our country that I'm a person without hope. I'm not like there's a lot of speakers that run around the country, it's all doom and gloom. They're like, oh, it's all over. Grab your guns and canned food. Go hide out at the ranch. It's like they got a black cloud that follows them around, like they've been weaned on a pickle. It's like they drink milk out of a churn. They're just depressing people. It's like, they're like those 10 spies that came back from the promised land. You remember when 12 of them came back? Well, 10 of them said, it's too hard. Giants are too big. There's no way we can win. The good book says that they depressed the people, and an entire generation ended up having to die in the wilderness because of their bad report, depressing everybody, and they weren't willing to go and fight. Well, there were two other guys with a totally different report, Joshua and Caleb, and they said, oh yeah, giants, huge, man, never seen guys so big. Fortified cities, oh, looks impossible, but it's not, because why? God's given us the land, let's go take it. So that's our attitude is, look, God's given us a great country, he's given us a great constitution, he's given us all the tools we need, everything we need at our fingertips to live out our faith and culture and be salt and light in everything that's happening in our nation. We don't need a revolution with bullets, we can have a revolution with ballots. We just simply live our freedom and we can direct the course of our country in a very positive way. And that's what consent of the governed means. It means you're in charge. Sometimes we think the politicians are in charge. Not true. They're working for us. So if we will engage in the process, if we will get up and say, I give my consent or I refuse my consent, the system works. But we have to actually work the system that we've been blessed to have. That's President James Garfield. He's actually a pastor as well. We've got one of his handwritten letters talking about preaching at a revival. And anyway, really cool stuff. Garfield put it this way for us this morning. He said, now more than ever before, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. He said, if that body be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt. I need a slide of a couple of people I'm thinking of right now, but I'm not going to do that. Okay, so if it be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt, it's because the people tolerate ignorance, recklessness, and corruption. If it be intelligent, brave, and pure, It's because the people demand these high qualities to represent them in the national legislature. If the next centennial, us, right? So if you go back, it's 100 years ago. So he's saying if the next centennial, he's talking about us right now. If the next centennial does not find us a great nation, it will be because the people who represent the enterprise, the culture, and the morality of the nation, that's us right here in this room, because we did not aid in controlling the political forces. He said if you look at Washington, or you look at Harrisburg, or you look at your local public officials, and you see corruption, or you see ignorance, or you see them taking us down a road that is dangerous and all those things, it's our fault. We have to be involved. We have to be engaged. And so that's the whole point of consent of the governed. And so how do we do that? I just want to give you a couple of action steps before I close out this morning. Most importantly is to pay attention to what's happening out there in the world. Most importantly is to know those principles, to study them, to take what your pastor's teaching and say, hey, I'm going to go apply this out there in the culture, especially in the way that I vote and the kind of government that I want to see happen. And so Charles Finney gave us a great warning on this. This is not John Travolta for all the Staying Alive fans out there. That's actually Charles Finney, second grade awakening. But now you know who Travolta modeled for that role in the white suit. He said the church must take right ground in regard to politics. Politics are part of a religion in a country such as this, and Christians must do their duty to their country as a part of their duty to God. He said God will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics. Now, you might say, well, Rick, wait a minute, politics and church, it just doesn't feel right. But think about it. Is there anything in your life that should be off limits from God's influence? Is there anything in your life that we shouldn't go to God's word for the answer of how it should work? The Bible speaks to money and economics and government and all of those things. And as believers, we should take that philosophy and go out there and be salt and light, literally salt, preserving the culture. We should be bringing out the flavor and the best of the culture by being salt and light in the culture. And that's all he's saying. He's saying just don't box in God to just a few areas of our lives. Let's make sure we're living out our faith in every single part of the culture. And we do that by participating in what we've been given, not buying into this secular spiritual split that, if you want to be good and holy, you stay over here, but you don't get into business or politics. No. It's all his. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Psalm 24:1. Let's take his principles into every area of the culture. We're that salt and light. Let's do what those guys did. Let's be willing to give of our life. That's our time, our fortune, yes, our money, and our sacred honor. It simply means, hey, invest in freedom. Spend a little time being a student of freedom. Understanding where we came from and how this system should work. One of the best things you can do is attend the Constitution class. Charlie's starting here at the church and other groups all around the nation. Take some time to fellowship with people as you study the foundations of the country and learn how to apply it. It's not too late. It's actually perfect timing. The culture is actually hungry for answers right now, especially these young people. Don't think that certain politicians in Washington, D.C. that don't even know what the three branches of government are represent the next generation, okay? There are a lot of great leaders coming up in this next generation. We train them at Patriot Academy. I get to see them firsthand at state capitals across the country. In fact, study the Constitution. Make sure you're voting. So know that there's some hope coming along. By the way, there's a great voter guide source at ChristianVoterGuide.com. Just click on your state and you get a piece of that. Don't be like some of my friends that say, I'm not voting, Rick. I will not vote for the lesser of two evils. I always say, well, unless Jesus Christ is on the ballot, you're going to vote for the lesser of two evils. Because I think somebody at some point said, there is none righteous, no, not one. Right? There's no perfect candidate. That's what I'm trying to say. Nobody. I have yet to find a candidate I agree with 100%. I don't even agree with myself 100% of the time. How am I going to find a candidate I agree? There is one person on the planet I agree with 100% of the time. You know who it is? It's my wife. Smart man, I heard. Whether she's right or wrong, she's right. You know what I'm saying? Okay, anyway. The point is you just got to do the best you can with what you got, where you are, and then work to have better candidates on the ballot next time. You look for the one that's the most correct in a biblical worldview. Not the most Republican or most Democrat. It's not about party. It's about principles. So which one has a good biblical worldview or is a 60% biblical worldview, right? If the other one's 20%, you go with the 60%. You do the best you can with what you got, where you are, and then you work hard overtime to change it. But just make sure you're voting. Your vote definitely counts. Hey, look, I lost by 20 votes out of 30,000 in my first state rep race. 20 votes. Now, we found some hanging chads right after that. And I won by 36 votes after the recount. So I got a great call from George Bush. This was 1998, so this was before Florida. And he was governor of Texas, and he calls and he says, Rick, he said, boy, that was close. He said, I'm officially dubbing you landslide green. He laughed. Thought that was real funny in 1998. 2000 Florida returns came in. He quit laughing about recounts. I'll tell you right now. So, in that case, 537 votes determined President of the United States. Now, folks, your vote counts every time. Let your voice be heard. Your values counted. That's Noah Webster right there. He said, when you become entitled to exercise the right of voting for public officers, let it be impressed on your mind that God commands you to choose for your rulers just men who will rule in the fear of God. The preservation of our government depends on the faithful discharge of this duty. If the citizens neglect their duty and place unprincipled men in office, the government will soon be corrupted. Laws will be made not for the public good so much as for selfish or local purposes. Corrupt or incompetent men will be appointed to execute the laws. The public revenues will be squandered on unworthy men, and the rights of the citizens will be violated or disregarded. If our government fails to secure public prosperity and happiness, it must be because the citizens neglect the divine commands and elect bad men to make and administer the laws. It's our job. It's our duty. There's so many ways you can do it. Lots of tools. Use Twitter. Use Facebook. Listen to our radio program. We'll encourage you. We'll give you tools. Get into these Constitution classes. Join groups that are engaged in this. And sponsor some students at Patriot Academy. Send us some of your young folks, 16 to 25 years old. We will send you back leaders well-grounded in the Constitution and the Founding Fathers and a biblical worldview. We gather at state capitals around the country in the summer, teach a biblical worldview. They live the life of a legislator. It's a great experience. In fact, I'm going to play you a 60-second video, and then I'll close. Here we go. Oh, let's see. I may not have done the sound correctly. Just imagine wonderful things being said right now. Great joke right there. Everybody laughed. That was children crying about how wonderful the program is. Okay, never mind. We'll skip that. So anyway, it's called Patriot Academy. It's a great opportunity. You send us your young people. We'll send you back leaders. And go to patriotacademy.com to learn more. Make sure that you're giving of your fortune to the church. See, if the church is the epicenter of the community, then you don't need government to be as big. But we have to be willing to put our money where our values are and make sure that we're doing those things that government shouldn't be doing, the church should be doing. And last, speak the truth with moral clarity. And that just means being willing to speak the truth regardless of what it costs you. You know, I always tell people, when people say bad things about me online and all that different stuff, hey, they're not shooting at me. Those of you that are veterans in this room, you are willing to die for my freedom. I'd at least be willing to speak up for what you are willing to die for. Amen? That's the way all of us ought to be. We ought to be willing. It's worth it. I used to ask people, what's your freedom worth? And I finally figured out the real question is, what's your child's freedom worth? What's your grandchild's freedom worth? What are we willing to do? God's given us this amazing nation, this incredible freedom that we have. Again, like I said at the beginning, let's not be the wicked and slothful servant. Let's not allow our nation to not retain the knowledge of God and professing ourselves to be wise, becoming fools. I mean, if you watch what's happening in the culture, we're becoming fools. I mean, that's just the truth of it. We can't even figure out, we're ignoring science and biology at this point. I mean, basic biology is now being thrown away. And it's because we're literally living out Romans 1. So let's make sure that we're doing our part in our communities and know that you're not alone. I get the privilege of traveling around the country. Millions of people are with you. They share your values. They want to see this nation restored and our constitutional republic restored. So I just appreciate you guys giving me a chance to come visit. Pastor David, thank you so much for the time this morning. God bless you guys for what you're doing. Thank you for being a beacon of hope in your community. God bless you guys. Pastor, thank you.